Okay, great. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about mummyberry. So mummyberry is a fungal pathogen that is caused by an organism called Monolinea vaccinii cormbosi. The disease cycle is interesting because it's a little more complex than some other things that we know about, in that it has two distinct phases. The overwintering inoculum carries over from one year to the next on mummified fruit that has fallen to the ground, and in the spring will develop these mushroom cups called apothecia that release spores, and the spores then land on the green leaf tissue for the first phase of the disease, the shoot blight phase. We also call those leaf strikes, and then a new set of spores emerges from that will infect the flowers and lead to the fruit infections. I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert here that the quiz questions that I have submitted for this talk have to do with the things that are colored in red here. Just so you know to pay attention to the information, because you'll get asked questions about the content on the quiz. We tried to keep it relatively simple, but the idea is to make sure that you are in fact watching the presentations. So just a little bit of orientation here in terms of where we're at right now. From as far as I can tell, most places are in the bud swell to bud burst or tight cluster developmental stage for blueberries. It's kind of covered in the red rectangle here. A little bit further along, perhaps in some areas, and maybe a little less further along, just to give us an idea of where we're at right now. And this graphic is a nice one from Michigan State that also describes that life cycle that I just mentioned, where in the winter time, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, but the winter overwintering inoculum are those fallen mummified fruit. The apothecia or mushroom cups that develop in the spring right around now, especially with the rain that we're having, will release spores we call ascospores that land on the green tissue, infect the green tissue, and create these lesions that are very characteristic. They're just a very distinctive stripe down the middle vein of the leaves that turns brown at first, eventually turns black, eventually the whole leaf turns black. But there are a new set of spores that are different. These are conidia that are formed on those lesions that are released, and they are actually attractive to pollinators. And so the pollinators help spread those spores around. Of course, we don't want to do anything to discourage our pollinators, so we're not going to try to interrupt the cycle there, but it does show you how important it is to control mummyberry in the first phase, the shoot blight phase, if at all possible. We still have another opportunity to try to control the blossom blight phase, but it's much harder, and by then there's more of the fungus present in the planting. So we really want to try to aim our actions against the shoot blight phase as much as we can. So how can we do this? There's a couple of different tactics that we can employ. One of them is raking or disturbing the area beneath the bushes to disrupt the mummies. That can be done in the fall. We can, in small plantings, maybe even rake up any mummified fruit, try to gather them up, although it's pretty hard to get them all. But doing some disruptive activities, cultivation and so forth underneath the bushes can help break things up a little bit. Another opportunity we have is to cover those, the mummified fruit beneath the bushes with a layer of mulch. If we're mulching anyway, we can time our mulch application to cover those up and create a physical barrier so that the mushroom cups cannot release the ascospores. And then finally, we have opportunities for fungicide sprays targeting either the early leaf tissue, protecting that tissue, or later on trying to protect the blossom tissue. So what are some of the, so here's another chart that I thought was really good. This comes from the New Jersey Commercial Blueberry Recommends. And it's a little hard to take all of this information in at once, so I'll try to walk you through it because I think it's useful. So on the bottom of the chart is a timeline that takes us through bud break and shoot growth and bloom and on through to berry development and harvest. So that's kind of the timeline that refers to different events in the blueberry planting. So we can look at when we're scouting for various things and when the diseases are active. In the very top of the chart are some suggested spray applications that can be made at various times. So I welcome having you look at this in more detail at some point later on to kind of take it all in, but I'm going to summarize it in terms of mummyberry by saying that our first spray application is made during the bud break to early leaf development period, around about, well, in some places now, but on a little bit further down the line, maybe next week or so, when the weather warms up and we get a little bit more movement. But first thing to know is to really understand your field history and know if you've had a problem with mummyberry in the past. That's a big piece of information to know what some of your decision points are going to be. You can monitor for apothecia, although I will say they are kind of hard to find if you're just randomly looking for them. A good practice in an area where you may have a problem with this disease is to collect up some of the mummies and put them in a part of the planting where you can find them. Put a flag next to them, but have it be in a place that's kind of representative of the conditions that are representative of that planting. So in other words, don't put them up by your house or someplace that's not really very much like where the blueberries are growing. But you can put a flag in so you can find them easily, and that way you can really target, you can know exactly when those mushroom cups are starting to appear. So as I said, the first spray can be around bud break or a little bit later on. And then when conditions are really conducive to infection, you may want to do another spray 5 to 7 days after that to really try to tamp down those shoot strike infections. And then if the conditions continue to be conducive to infection and you know you've had a big problem, you may do a third spray, again another 7 days or so later, to target that blossom blight. And also be aware that any frost or freeze event will make tissue more susceptible. So paying attention to what's going on in terms of temperatures can also be really helpful in making successful spray applications. This is a list of some of the materials that are recommended for mummyberry control. There's quite a few, and I just wanted to list them out here. The ones that have a high efficacy rating, although efficacy ratings can be really difficult to rely on because sometimes they really vary from one person's chart to another person's chart, and some materials don't really have good efficacy data available for us. But here's a list of a lot of the common materials and whether or not they're recommended for the shoot strike phase or the blossom blight phase. Many of them are effective on both. Some are not, and I can't really explain to you exactly why. For example, Quadris top is not so much recommended for shoot strike, but is for blossom blight, and the same is true for switch. Maybe Dan or somebody else would be able to answer those questions a little better than I. Miravis Prime is a brand new material. I've only seen it recommended for the shoot strike phase. I don't really know if it works for blossom blight. And Luna Tranquility is one that's had a lot of inconsistency in terms of its efficacy. So I think it's something that you can consider, but I can't really say for sure how effective it is. I included a column for anthracnose because if you see in the previous chart, I'll just step back for a second, this blue line does cut through anthracnose and botrytis blossom blight as well. So if you're making an application at that time, you may want to choose a material that's also effective for one or the other of those if you've had a problem with those in the past. But the most important thing that I wanted to say from this slide is that when you're making repeat applications, you want to make sure that you're changing your fungicide resistance groups and not making, for example, a repeat application of a group 3 material or a repeat application of one of the other groups 7 or 11 and so forth. So pay attention to the rotation, think about it ahead of time, know what your options, what you want your program to be if you need to make 2 or 3 applications, what you're going to choose so you're not having to figure it out you know, on the spur of the moment. There are some organic materials. Organic materials are even harder to get efficacy data on. Cornell has done a good job over the years of generating some good recommendations based on really studying the literature and looking for evidence of a study or two, several studies at least, showing efficacy. And so several of these materials are ones that show up in their guide. Actinovate, double nickel, and serenade are ones that, that do show up in the Cornell Organic Production Guide. EcoSwing, I believe, is very new. It's a Gowan product, and I've been getting some information from Gowan about it, suggesting that it is very effective. And one of the studies that they did or cite in their literature showed it as effective as Indar. I have no experience with it, and I would love to hear from anyone who has used it to let me know or let blueberry growers know whether or not they felt that it was effective. Finally, I think this is the last slide. I wanted to just make a comment about pollination and pollinators, especially for that blossom blight application if you're having to make one at that time. We generally think of fungicides as being relatively safe for pollinators, but we're starting to learn some new information about synergistic effects with other materials. And I don't think it's likely that anyone would be tank mixing a fungicide with an insecticide during blueberry bloom. The only situation that I can think of where that might happen is if you have a problem with plum curculio. But if there is a reason that you need to put an insecticide in the tank at that time, be very, very careful, first of all, with that application, but also be aware that there may be an especially synergistic effect with pyrethroid insecticides mixed with, tank mixed with fungicides. And we have some of this information in our New England tree fruit and small fruit guides sort of summarized, but some of it is based on a really good publication out of Oregon State that has the link at the bottom of the screen here. And so I encourage you to take a look at that because I think it's really helpful in making your pesticide choices relative to bee safety. So I think with that, that's the last slide that I have. Any questions? I'll take a look at the